Okay, so in this video, I'm just going to cover a couple types of little programming methods or topics that I guess were useful for the last project in a little bit more detail, and they should be somewhat useful for probably the term project, but I'm not exactly sure. So um, these are just general coding things, which I've got listed here, and I'm going to write some code and we can see a little bit more about them. So the first thing you always have to do in a program is you have to import functions. So the ones that we were using were stuff like math, pandas, and pyplot. And if you give them this as kind of PLT, that's just like a nickname that you can use in order so that you don't have to type out the whole thing. So PD is usually for pandas. You can call it whatever you want, but these are sort of typical ones that people use for programming. An important thing, especially for our projects, is probably variable scopes. If you're usually having issues, it's probably because you're not accessing your variables in the correct scope, or you're overwriting them somewhere that you're not expecting them to be. So, for example, if we just start with some easy stuff, if we say a is equal to 1, then this is technically like sort of a global variable, so any functions or loops inside of this program can access this variable when it's on sort of this indentation level, which is the furthest one here. If you indent more towards the right, then you will kind of encapsulate stuff, and we're going to talk about that. I'm just going to define another one. We can say b is equal to a plus 1. And in this case, this will basically read the value of a, which has already been defined, and it will add 1 to it. So a has to be defined above in order for this to work. So basically, if we have, so if I run this, there's no issues, but if we set this to C and you don't have a defined, it should complain. Oh yeah, and then Python's weird. It's actually, I could probably explain this. Python's weird because it stores the values of like variables inside of like memory or something. So a being 1 is actually remembered. So if we do print b, then it should print out 2. So it prints out 2 because a is actually still stored. So if you restart the kernel, and that should just clear the memory, I think, and then we do this, we get an error and a is not defined. So that's how that kind of works. So we're going to go back and we're going to define a, and we're going to keep going. So now let's just define c as another third variable, and we can set that equal to 5. Something that's super useful are basically lists. So you can define a list like so. This would be, the name is numbers, and this would just be an empty list. Now you can populate this with basically any type of variable, which can even be like an object. You can put integers, you can put doubles, you can put letters, strings, anything into this. Python's very flexible with this. If you're using Java, you have to actually define every variable. But in Python, it kind of figures out that a is an integer by like reading what it is. And so whatever you shove into this list, that's what it's going to become a list of. And then we can do values. We can make another list. I think, well, yeah, this, you can also define an empty list like this. And if you want to make a list of numbers, you can go like 1, 2, 3. separated by commas, and this would be a list with 3 integers, 1, 2, and 3. But we just want to make it empty, and we're going to fill it up later. All right, for the, I'm going to make one method here. So we've done this a little bit for our projects, but let's just make a method called math function. And we're going to pass it 2 variables. So whatever you call these inside here, it doesn't really matter. So we're just calling them A and B right now. And then, but this doesn't matter. This is not going to refer to this A and B because these are kind of like inside of their own scope. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. So I'll get to it a little bit more, but basically these you will pass in numbers, and then they're just going to be stored in these local variables called A and B. So let's write out the function, and then we'll talk about what local kind of means. So we can give it, we can create another variable called result. So Python's really good. You can call like anything. You can give really descriptive names to variables. All right, I'm just going to write this out to some extent. Okay, so here's a function that basically I made up. So here we're actually using the library. So we're using Euler's number, and so we're going to use the math library. I think honestly probably Pandas has it. I forget exactly. But in order to figure this stuff out, like if you want to use log, I just Google like how do I use log in Python, and then it'll tell you go pandas.log or math.log. So it's usually not hard to figure this out, and you can Google it really easily. But here we're using, we're accessing the Euler's number inside of the math library. And so there's probably more functions behind that, probably like a numerical method or something. But we don't need to worry about that. And then we're just raising it to the power. So I really like using the 2 stars. It seems to work pretty well. I think in other programming languages it can be like a hat like that, but 2 stars is what works in Python. And we're putting all of this, or e to the power of all of this, and here we're just using the 2 variables that have been passed in, which are A and B. We are multiplying A by -1, and then we are adding B to it. And so here we've got something that looks somewhat like an exponential function. And now we're going to, now what you always have to do is you have to return something. In Java and other programs, it's more sticky about what you're returning. I think here, like the type doesn't matter. You just need to return something, and then it'll deal with it. You can sometimes run into problems with variables, but then you just gotta debug it and kind of think about what you're doing. That's probably the worst thing about Python. Otherwise, it's really easy to use. So here we've got a math function defined, and let's define a for loop. Let's talk about a for loop. So say I want to make a for loop. You always have to write it something like this. So yeah, so here basically we have an kind of integer or something like I, and I forget if it starts at 0 or 1. That would be good to know, but you can just Google that. It's a little bit weird, but basically it'll go up to the range of the value of C. So we have C equal to 5. So this is going to read the C from here. And then I'm pretty sure this starts at 1, so it's going to do 5 iterations, basically. So you don't need a counter. In Java, it's a little bit more explicit. You like say what the I value would start at, so you define it within here, and then you'd actually iterate it, or you'd write a little couple letters of code, which would show that it's being iterated. It's just all kind of implied in Python, but it's going up by 1 each time you reach the end of the loop. It's pretty straightforward. So say we want to count how many times we're doing the loop. So we can create a counter and set it equal to 0. And then we can probably just print it out. So I don't think you have to put it into brackets, but I always like putting stuff into brackets. Brackets make it usually nicer to see. So let's see if we run this. Yeah. So if we look at the counter, it's printing out that it's printing out the value of counter, which is 0, and it does it 5 times because it's looping from 1 to 5. So that's basically what we would expect. So if we want the counter to actually count, what we need to do is we have to call it or write it something like this. So counter is equal to counter plus 1. So the previous value of counter, we're going to add 1 to it and set that to the new value of counter. And then we're going to print that new value. Now if we run this, it's working, but it shouldn't be working because we don't have counter defined above here. So if you've been coding for a while or kind of working on a project and then switching stuff around here and there, then what might happen is that it's got some of your values left in memory, and then I don't know if you save it and reclose your folder or just restart the kernel, and then you try to rerun it again, it has an issue because counter is not defined. So what you have to do is you can define counter inside of the scope, but that's going to do what we had, which is the problem that it's going to repeat the value. It's not actually going to reset it between each loop. So what you have to do is you have to define counter outside of the scope. So here we'll define it as 0. And then when we call this counter, it's actually going to change this one, and it's going to add 1 each time. And so now we get a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is kind of important. It's honestly probably the hardest part of this project, and then a little bit of setting up your loops. But making sure that everything's in its right scope is very, very important. So also talking about scope, this A and B are referring to the A's and B's inside here, inside of this defined math function. And you can tell the scope basically like from these semicolons and from this indent. So if you mess up the indent, it would take these values. So we can try this. I'm going to reset the kernel. It should... Oh, okay. It just doesn't like the indent because basically it's getting really confused here. There's nothing inside the function anymore. This is like its own variable, which can be evaluated. It would use these values, but then return result isn't doing anything. It doesn't really understand that. If we did print result, unless it freaks out because there's nothing inside of the method, this should work. So it is, yeah, so it's freaking out because of the method. So it's pointing to this line, but there's nothing really wrong with this line. So like if we delete this, I'm pretty sure that's the line that's making the error. Wait, let's reset the kernel. Oh, okay, so now what it's complaining about is that it just doesn't like this indent. So this is like good to see. You can't just randomly indent stuff. It has to basically be within some kind of scope. So either a method or a for loop. So if I run this finally, then it's okay. And it'll use these values in order to do the result, and then it prints it out. We're going to undo all of that. Try to get our math function back. Okay, so I just use Control Z to undo. And yeah, that's pretty much that. So you always want to make sure your scope is good, In Java, it's a lot easier to see because you would basically encapsulate with like these brackets, and then your indentations don't actually matter. But in Python, your encapsulation is done with the indents, so you can't mess those up or everything doesn't work. Alright, so I think we're going to jump into the while loop. Or we're going to make a while loop, basically. So here, what I'd like to do with this while loop is make something, it's not exactly the same as our project, but it's going to be something relatively similar in terms of coding. But again, I feel like if you don't really know what's going on, I don't know how much this is going to help. But this should just explain some questions about programming. Again, I don't really know exactly what to cover, so I'm just kind of going randomly here. Okay, wait, we don't want this counter here. So what I'd like to do with this function is that we're going to... So, sorry, for a while loop, you start by saying while, then you need a conditional. So here we're going to check if the value is less than the value of C. We're going to define value to be equal to the math function. And we're going to pass it A and B. So now these two A's and B's, there's no A and B defined in this scope. There's an A and B defined in this scope, but this A and B basically, I don't want to say dies, but they disappear after you leave this function. So the only A's and B's that these can access are these two global ones. So when the program reaches this line, it's going to go and access these two and evaluate the math function using these two. So then these two are going to go through here. It's going to go into the math function, run through this, return the result here, and store that into value. We're going to do a little bit more stuff. So what I want is that I want this function to kind of change. So I was making this up and it kind of did what I wanted it to do, but I'm not really, this doesn't really have any physical meaning. So what I want it to do is to kind of change. And so we're going to subtract A, or we're going to subtract 1 from A between each loop. So that's going to change the value, well, the value of the variable value. And what that's going to do is that that's actually going to affect this conditional. So what I wanted to do with this while loop is write something that will use a variable in the conditional, and it'll change as the while loop goes on. And so value will change as it goes on because of A here changing. Again, this A is going to be changing this A, so it's going to become negative, and then this should change the whole function. Okay, so I think what I want to show now, and hopefully this is okay, but something that's, could be... Oh, actually, yeah, we've got it right here. Okay, so what I want to show now is that you can stick... Oh yeah, I didn't talk about if statements, but there's also if statements, which are kind of useful. But they're basically just true and false conditionals, and they're like a junction that you can take the program one way or another based on some logical value. But what I want to do is if we stick this while loop inside of the for loop. So you can see it's inside of the for loop because the while loop starts with these indentations. So it's one indent from the for loop to the right, and then everything else inside is one indent, another indent to the right. So this while loop is now inside the for loop, and every time we run through this for loop, we would run through this while loop. So say I want to count how many times the while loop happens. what you can do is you can stick the counter inside here, and this won't count. We know that the for loop's going to run 5 times, theoretically. We can stick this here, and then we can print out the counter every time we're about to finish a loop. So it's going to use this counter all the way up here. And what we can even do now is we don't need to keep this counter global in case we want another counter. We can put that inside of this for loop. So now inside of this for loop, we've got a counter, and then we've got this while loop, and the counter starting at 0, and then every time the while loop goes, the counter is going to go up. We're going to print the counter, and then the counter is going to reset. So now what we can also do is, let's add one more print statement so that it just looks a little bit nicer. We can add print and then throw in a space like this. You probably don't even need a space. But what this should do is that it should basically skip a line. I know in Java there's a print line function, so I think there's better ways to do this. But every time the while loop terminates, we should print a line between each for loop. So let's see if this actually gives something. And it's giving us a ton of errors. Okay, so it's saying that the name value is not defined. So that's exactly the same problem with the counter. Now, there might be better ways to do this, but like for my project, I was kind of just doing it like this. So let's just define value up here. We can set that equal to 0. So I just want to talk about where you're setting these initial values for your variables for our projects is like very important. If you set this inside of this for loop, that will have that could have a different effect on the program than if you set it up here. So you need to know what you want to be changing and what you don't want to be changing in each of your loops. So we can run this again. Okay, so we actually got some numbers. So here, let's restart the kernel just because we have a lot of stuff stored in memory. I want to see what will happen if we do it like this. Okay, so basically what this looks like to me is that we're running through the while loop only once. So that's probably because for I in range C, that's probably because what's happening is that we're increasing the value and until it's greater than C, which happens after 2 kind of iterations of the while loop. And then value here stays greater than C. So the for loop goes another 4 times, and there's no actual change to value. So there's a few ways we can change this. You can try and change what value is set to. So let's see if that works. So if we try to set value equal to 0, then what we can see is that value gets set to 0, and then it starts looping again. And now we're getting the other 4 loops. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to change actually the other variable, which is going to be C. So behind this print statement, let's stick in, we're going to change C. We're going to set C equal to C plus 1000. And then we're also going to change A equal to 5. So these are just mostly like random mathematical parameters. For our project, you actually have to, apply the petroleum engineering. So it's going to make sense in our project. But right now I'm just trying to get this to kind of give me a certain output. So now what we can see is that we've got in the output, we've got a lot more counters, or basically a lot more while loop iterations. So for the first one, we go in 2 times, then we go in 11 times, then 12 times, and then 13 times. And that's pretty nice. So what we can do, let's say we want to actually see the value of value and print it out. So this is really useful for debugging. So we're going to print out counter first. We have to put this str in front because if you're trying to print out stuff with words, well, I'll keep going. It'll make more sense. I'll just write out the whole line. So we can write value is equal to, and then put a space, and then we can add another str value. Okay, so what we're doing here is that we're trying to print out the counter. We're trying to print out the word or the letters value and then equals, and then we're also trying to print out the value of the number or the number of the value. And so basically here you have to change these to a string because if you don't, then the print statement can't actually mix the string value, because when you've got double quotations and it's in red, this is a string, with a number, which is either a double or an integer. So if we do this, it's going to freak out at this line. And then if we let it have the string back, so we're forcing this or casting it into a string, then we actually get stuff. So now here we can see the iterations in front, and then we can see the value of the value of the number that we're calculating from the math function. All right, so yeah, hopefully this is somewhat decent. The last thing I'm going to talk about a little bit is graphing. This is pretty obvious, and in our project it's actually all done for us, so we don't really need to worry about this. But let's see, what are our, so we've got numbers and we've got value lists. So let's go numbers dot append, and we're just going to stick C into it. So our empty list, it doesn't have anything, and what this is going to do is that every time we finish basically all of the iterations for a while loop, once we reach the end of the for loop, we're going to append the value of C, the new value of C basically, to this. So the first value of C would be 5, but here we're adding 1,000 and then we're appending it. If we wanted to start at 5, you can move this over. It doesn't really matter for our purposes because this has 0 context in the real world. Now, if we want to, let's talk about this. Now, if we want to append the values to the value list, we can write this and then value. So, just to reiterate again, you call the list variable name, which would be value list in this case, then you write dot append. That's a method. Somewhere in Python somebody wrote it. And then inside of these brackets, you put in whatever value you want to add. This value is going to change with each iteration, so we're going to get different values. So let's do this, and then let's go plot it basically. So again, this stuff has to be inside of the for loop. If you want it to happen there, you could theoretically put it inside of the while loop, and then you're going to get a really long list. Maybe we can stick that into there later just to kind of show you how that's going to change. So honestly, the hardest thing I found with this project is that if you had variables in the wrong spot, it could just give you really weird numbers. And until you kind of get them all in the perfect spot, once you know the procedure, then it could be pretty messy. So really, again, the scope of variables and the encapsulation is very important when dealing with loops like this. So what we can do, let's jump out. So we're going to jump outside of the for loop. This is going to happen after the entire for loop is completed. Let's print out the value of the numbers that we have. So printing stuff is very good to check for like kind of debugging, and then you can make it, it'll go into your console, so just like here, and you can change it however you want. Okay, so now I'm gonna write the code to plot it. So that would be something like this. Okay, so you can like Google this. It's not hard. It's actually very easy to plot in Python compared to other programs, roughly speaking. But basically, this would just be a plot function. So we're using the library, matplotlib library dot pyplot, and then we're just calling it by the alias or the nickname, which is plt. Then we're calling the function plot, and now we're passing it in a value for the x values and the y values. I kind of forget which one's which, but we can figure that out from the plot basically. And then this third thing is just an option for a tag. You can change the type of plot that is there. For our project, again, I think the professor basically wrote this code, and you don't have to edit it at all. So it's all good the way it is. And then I think you need this show. I kind of forget if you actually need it. Oh, it's freaking out. Let's solve the. Let's debug it and then see what may be the problem. So value list is not defined. Values list. So see how typos are bad. So the code or programs will always do exactly what you tell them to. And so you can't have really typos. You can have typos in strings, but like print statements, but not really in the logic of the code. Alright, so let's see what's happening here. So it's unhappy with this because I think we changed values.list. Let's call it with an S. Value list, values list. Doesn't matter what it's called as long as it's all called the same thing. Alright, so now here we can actually see it. So you don't, oh, we do have show. I want to see if it works without show. I assume it doesn't. Okay, it does. I don't know why you need show. So I see this like when you Google it up, then it says show. I think it probably shows other things if you add, like axes titles and stuff. But yeah, basically. So here we can see that the numbers are printed out here. This is the numbers list. This is the values list. So something interesting here is like it's exponential, which kind of makes sense. There's an exponential function that we were dealing with, and then it kind of plateaus here, which is kind of weird. So this can be something unintentional, and if we look at the code, we can see why might that be happening. So we're appending the value. So here, let's see. So it's basically, it's in the second one, and when we printed out the second one, that was values list. So we're appending values list over here. Yeah, so we're appending values list over here, and we're appending C here. And we can see that basically value only changes inside of the while loop. And then it goes through, and then it changes inside of the while loop again. But here we're actually changing the value of C outside of the while loop. And so what will happen is that C will actually get updated fully, but then the new value of values hasn't actually been updated. So if you'd like to remedy this, you can just move this over to somewhere like here. And now if you run it, we can see that this doesn't happen. At least on the graph it doesn't happen. We still have two 8,000s here. Just gonna restart the kernel. I just want to see if it's doing. Oh no, it's unhappy with something. Print values list. Value. Oh, it's so this is again problems with Python. If you really want to just always restart stuff, because it was holding values in memory and then it was doing weird stuff and not updating stuff and going without it. Okay, so here we can see that we've finally fixed it. Before it was holding the old 5 or 6 values. Now it's got the new ones, and there's basically no issue. And so we can see that we have plotted this. One thing I'd like to show is, say we want to update, say we want to make the, create the strings by using more values here. So I don't exactly know what this is going to do, but it's going to make a very different looking plot. All right, so here we can see how this completely changed the result in a sense. It's graphed all of these extra ones, but some of them are basically the exact same. That's because when we put it outside, we're skipping a lot more of the values, and we don't have like 5 redundant ones. But here you can technically see how these change as something. I don't know. It's just a random math function. But my point is that if you stick something elsewhere inside of a different scope, it can have a very big effect on the output and what's basically going on. So yeah, I think that should cover some useful stuff. I think for loops, while loops potentially. Graphing is not really a challenge, I'd say, on this project. Methods, we've done that before. Mostly just seeing how code works is probably going to help. But this is kind of a similar example to what we were doing. It's not really that close, I'd say, and this has been pretty long of a tutorial or something, I don't know. So I think I'll leave it here, and you can put some questions down into the discussion board or comment, I guess, on the video, and I can make one more for the final project. I'm not sure how much this probably won't help for this project so much because it's due tomorrow and I kind of did it today. But for the term project, this could help. So yeah.